A very good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I'm Arnold Zagawa. On the agenda tonight, a possible El Nino event this year could bring another round of drought conditions for southern Africa. It will be another body blow for the region's agricultural sector, already contending with climate change, unsustainable debt, rising costs, the politics of land reform, as well as the march of the armyworms, among other pests. Our guests will run the rule over the state of agriculture in the region. Also, we will look at how blockchain technology is changing the financial landscape for intra-African trade, and we will catch up with the developments in Cameroon following last year's suspect elections. But first, the South African Minerals Resource Minister, that's Gwede Mantashe, kicked off the 4-day mining investment in Indaba in Cape Town today, and again sent a message to communities opposed to mining on their ancestral lands that mining makes sense, even if communities are against strip mining. Take a look.
The other challenge that is beginning to face the mining industry is the question of how do we deal with mining communities? Because if we leave mining communities and there is a harmonious relationship between mining companies and communities, it's actually a destructive relationship that we are experiencing. We must begin to ensure that we coexist with mining. If we don't, mines are going to struggle. We must ensure that they see the benefits of mining. Mining must not only be seen from a negative point of view, where it is seen as destroying the environment, as polluting the environment, polluting water. It must be seen as benefiting communities, and people must take pride of having mines in their communities. So that is the next issue that is going to face many mining companies everywhere they go. It is the time for just focusing on just the shareholder is gone. Mining companies must be seen to be looking after the shareholders. They must be looking after communities, after their own workers. And I always explain that workers are the people who convert investment into wealth, and therefore they deserve respectable treatment by the mining companies.
Now, intra-Africa trade is often cited as a key to realizing Africa's economic potential. But the use of the US dollar as a settlement currency acts in many ways as a stumbling block towards this ideal. But blockchain technology is being adopted to sideline the US dollar in commercial transactions and, in doing so, cut the cost of doing business. Many thanks for making time to speak to us, Edward. Just give us a sense of how much this is actually a game changer, because we do know intra-Africa trade is lagging, but the reports here that you're actually forwarding do show that Bitcoin might hasten this process.
Well, I think the big problem that there is with intra-African trade is so much of it has to use US dollars. And you have two different trading parties who want their own currencies, and they're not able to trade internationally unless they have dollars. What blockchain can bring is that level of trust that you get from traditional trade finance products, but with a lot more flexibility and without the need to use US dollars. Ultimately, you can agree transactions, you can come up with contracts, and you can settle all of your business using the blockchain and the trust that that brings. But the actual settlement in currency could be in local currency on both sides. And that's the real thing. It can really take away the need for the US dollar, which brings a huge amount of cost and a huge amount of compliance that doesn't need to exist if we're thinking about trade inside Africa itself.
Edward, you're raising some very strong points here, but one thing that the dollar is synonymous with is, one, predictability and stability, and we do need that for intra-Africa trade. The other thing is it is not as volatile, but it is very trustworthy. Now, when it comes to many payment solutions out there on the market, don't get me started on some names. One, they are used for very illicit financing and payments. But second, there's a lot of volatility in the market.
Well, I think we need to separate two issues here. One is blockchain technology, and the other is cryptocurrencies. And I think Bitcoin, which is what you're referring to. I would fully agree that a cryptocurrency like a Bitcoin is a solution looking for a problem. It's not being used, Bitcoins, for international payment settlement. It's mostly being used as some kind of speculative investment vehicle. But blockchain technology is different. And the kind of technologies that we're looking at the moment in Africa, we are seeing the use of the blockchain to connect people together, to transfer very, very sensitive documentation, to give those kind of verifications that you require, but not actually exchanging currency at all. Having local currency payments in escrow accounts in different countries. For example, a trade flow, let's say, between Vietnam and Cote d'Ivoire. Usually that would require dollars in both directions, but if you can use a settlement via the blockchain and do all of your business that way, you can have local payment in currency.
Edward, let's talk about smart contracts, because this is something that has made its round in the past year or two. Of course, blockchain here, like you're mentioning, can actually facilitate many of these transactions. But to what extent is smart contracts the future here, at least, let's say, in the next 2-3 years?
Well, I think you could say that the smart contracts is what weaponizes the blockchain. The blockchain has been described as a kind of a truth engine. You can put information in there encrypted and protected. But if you have something where you can use tokens to exchange between different parties, you have an ability to really weaponize the blockchain. And like all uses of the blockchain, there is good and bad. One of the best uses is the smart contract. So if you think, it could be that the moment certain goods arrive in a place, let's say a warehouse, and it's registered electronically, they've arrived, you could automatically having a payment going from one of the banks to the supplier. You wouldn't have to wait 2 to 3 days for all of the different kind of paperwork. So smart contracts have enormous power. And in fact, they are the basis of Ethereum, the idea why Ethereum was created in the first place. And really, they are the ones who can remove all of these trust blockages that we have in the value chain.
Edward, there's been a very contentious issue in the past. I might derail you a bit here. When it comes to the CFA, a few West African countries that are actually making transactions with one currency, the franc, close to 5 or 6 countries for the western part, the central part also using a CFA. Wouldn't this, a single currency for blocks and ultimately Africa as a whole, hasten the process in amalgamation with the blockchain technology?
Well, I think basically it's very a strong benefit to have for the CFA francs then that they have a single currency, and this is pegged to the franc or to the euro and guaranteed by the Bank of France. But they gain so much from it, because if you take the CFA franc zone, you have a single language, a single currency, a single central bank, a single legal system as well. So that is really helpful for intra-Africa trade. We've also seen in East Africa that there are payments agreements between the central banks, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. And there are more efforts underway to try and make it easier for central banks to exchange funds between them. But I definitely think blockchain could help enhance this. If you look at Africa now, we have a number of quite effective trade blocks together. If a franc zone, the EAC, SADC, blockchain is something that could help those different financial systems come together and remove those other blockages outside the trade blocks.
Many thanks for that, Edward. Now, the arrest of Cameroon's main opposition leader, Maurice Kamto, last week is raising political temperatures. 85-year-old President Paul Biya won the 7th consecutive term in October elections last year and has now been president for 36 years. Apart from claims of a rich vote, the former French colony is also dealing with an armed conflict by its English-speaking citizens that are demanding their own state. Joining us from the capital, Yaoundé, is investigative journalist Amindeh Atabong. Amindeh, thanks for making time to speak to us. Just walk us through the dynamics here. First of all, the poll. That's, of course, the poll with an O. President Paul Biya coming to the scene yet again for another election. Just walk us through how the poll was to start with.
Just the fact that the president was himself a candidate in the last presidential elections made the elections to be contentious. And after the vote, we saw that there were a lot of complaints which were filed at the Constitutional Council for either the partial cancellation or the total cancellation of the elections. But as it went down, the president was finally declared winner by the country's Constitutional Council, and since then there have been tensions here and there across the country.
I mean, if we were to talk about this particular rift between the Anglophone and the Francophone Cameroonians, it's always a very complex issue. A few reports that have come out in the past have been pointing towards the Francophones being favored in a public office. Is this something you can actually confirm, or is it just he say, she say?
Now, the crisis itself has its roots in the country's colonial history, which stems from the partition between Britain and France during the colonial period. But to say it has nothing to do with marginalization will be an overstatement, because most of the activists have been complaining about marginalization, which some are real and others are perceived. And I think it's because the activists or the people who are complaining about marginalization have actually felt that over the years, in terms of economic marginalization, in terms of social, in terms of cultural, and in many other aspects.
If we're to talk about the opposition leader Kamto's arrest, this is just over a week ago, if I'm correct. He was, of course, arrested in Douala. Just give me a sense of the charges. What was he actually charged with to start with?
Maybe before I give you his charges, I want to state the reason why he first of all went down to the streets. He was complaining of what he termed the electoral hold-up after the polls in October last year. Equally complained of the government's failure to put in place sports infrastructure to enable the country host the 2019 African Cup of Nations. So that is actually what pushed him to the streets, in addition to government's failure to resolve the Anglophone crisis, which has been ravaging the northwest and southwest English-speaking regions of Cameroon, and which has claimed over 1,000 lives. So that's the main reason why the opposition leader descended on the streets. And since he was arrested in the economic capital last Monday, he was transferred to Yaoundé and has been levied many charges that amounts to treason, charging for group rebellion, insurrection, hostilities to the state, disturbance of public peace and public service, amongst others.
One thing that's very fascinating here is it wouldn't be fair to talk about his arrest alone and not talk about maybe the rapper Valsero and his former campaign manager. That's, of course, Kingu. Just give us a sense of whether or not someone who only managed to get 14% of the vote, at least according to the Electoral Commission, how does he garner this many people and rally them to the streets? Is this a signification of how relevant Kamto actually is?
Yes, to say he's relevant, you are right. He's actually relevant. He wasn't arrested alone. According to the Minister of Communication, a total of 117 protesters were arrested in about 5 towns in the country. And when you look at the situation, you understand that the followers he could easily garner is because many people have this feeling of frustration with the system because of unemployment, because of maybe administrative bottlenecks to get their startups move on. So many youths have that frustration, and they can easily answer to such calls for street demonstrations.
Right. If we're to talk about going forward, very briefly, just walk me through what the future holds. Is this a case that can be taken to a constitutional court? What does the future hold here?
At the moment, he's still being held at the Special Operations Court of the National Police. Maybe when he will start appearing in open courts, it's from there that one will be able to discern what the future will hold for him. Because with other cases, at times, following pressure, maybe the government may decide to release him even before the case comes up in open court. It has happened before to other protesters in the past, and that possibility is not ruled out. But should he be found guilty, he risks going to life imprisonment following the country's anti-terrorism law, which was put in place in 2014.
Amindeh, many thanks for that, and we'll definitely be keeping tabs on that particular story. Let's move on now. After the break, how stressed is agriculture in Southern Africa? And should we be concerned? All that and more after this. Welcome back to Capital Connection. Now, agriculture is facing many threats, from climate change to farm debt. Joining us to discuss the agricultural sector and the many challenges it is facing at the moment is Wessel Lemmer, who's ABSA's senior agricultural economist. Many thanks for making time to speak to us, Wessel. If we're to talk about the agriculture space, much of sub-Saharan Africa is actually a net importer of food. I mean, the figure that came out from the World Bank just the other day was close to 35 billion US dollars, that is. Just give me a sense of where South Africa is sitting on this particular spectrum.
Well, South Africa is actually a net exporter. If you look in terms of agriculture. In the total agriculture, we export on the livestock sector, which is about 50% of our gross producer value of total agriculture. We export beef. We have this foot and mouth disease problem now that we can't export beef. We export ostrich. On the horticultural side, we are net exporters. We are amongst the world, Southern Hemisphere countries, the biggest exporter of citrus, so and wine and grapes. And then you have obviously the grain and oilseed sector, which we are also a net exporter. Unfortunately, this year our rainfall that we received was about 50% of the normal monthly rainfall distribution up to optimum planting time in December. So farmers, a lot of them, had to plant after that time period, and that makes we may face some imports on maize. And that's just now specific for this coming season, for the marketing year.
It's quite interesting because before we came on, you actually did allude to this, the timing of the planting season and how this actually does impact ultimate output and aggregate output across South Africa. Just give me a sense of what we actually did see in November, December regarding many of the planting seasons in the region.
Well, if you compare the rainfall as it arrived throughout the season until December. Mid-December is our optimal planting time for the western production regions. So we received, our rainfall pattern was very similar to 2016 of the drought. So during that time, we saw prices increase to import parity price levels. Currently, prices have been over the past 2 years at export parity, near export parity price levels, which is good for the consumer, by the way, because when you export food, you export it at export prices. But as soon as you start to have to import maize, which is a staple for the most of lower income citizens in South Africa, prices can increase quite tremendously. We saw, for instance, because of this late plantings that we had, and farmers needed to plant in January, which is quite unusual, the yield can drop by 70 to 80 kilograms per day as you progress planting later and later in the season. Then you have the risk of frost and cooler temperatures, so the yield will be lower. Although we plant a similar amount of hectare than the previous year, our yields will be down, and we would be probably have to import about between 1.1 and 1.4 million tons of maize. Now, just because of that, we saw a jump in prices the past 2 months for white maize about 66%, and yellow maize 40 to 44%. Now, the white maize goes into white maize flour for the consumer as a staple. And last time when we saw that happened, it was in 2016, and food prices increased to double-digit inflation.
That's quite interesting, because if we're to contrast that to the recent private sector credit extension numbers that came in, we actually do see this also reflected. I'm not saying the two are actually correlating here or even any causality. That is private sector credit extension, but I'm just trying to draw a picture between the debt in the economy, well, the credit being extended in the economy, to maybe the farmers out there. And we actually have seen a moderation for the December numbers. If I'm right, this was 5.1% for the credit being issued. Are we seeing the same when it comes to the agriculture sector, at least in your line of work, the credit being extended to farmers?
Well, you will remember that the farmer, when he plants and he didn't receive rain and he didn't have hectares to actually benefit from later rainfall, and he don't have any yield, he cannot benefit from the increased price of maize. So for those individual producers that don't have a crop, so they can't utilize the higher maize price, they are in trouble. So their repayment ability is affected quite severely. But if you look in terms of the total grain and oilseed sector, if you have a lower crop, lower yield, but you have a high price, the gross producer value over time in the long term more or less stay more stable than the variation that you get in production and price. So the high price make up for a lower yield, so eventually you have a gross producer value that's more or less the same than the previous year. Not exactly, a bit lower for this coming year, but it's actually good. And why do I say it's good? We have this free market environment in South Africa where price signal to the producer how much and what to plant. We don't have the subsidies that the EU and the US give to those producers of theirs. So having this free market environment actually assists us, the economy actually assists the producer to go through this drought scenario with higher prices in the system, just to recover more easily. You can just imagine if you have low prices in a regulated environment and a small yield, there's no way that you're going to get out of trouble in the next year. You need those higher prices. But unfortunately, we also see those prices giving through to the consumer. Our low economic growth put our consumers under pressure, and that's not the only thing that may rise, because you see our livestock prices, poultry, beef, mutton and pork will also have to increase to keep those livestock industries profitable when you see an increase in feed prices, animal feed prices by 15 to 20%. So it's quite a complicated situation.
It is quite complicated indeed. And one thing that's very striking here is, of course, these happen to be leading indicators, the ones that I am alluding to. But if we want to look at the CPI inflation for November, that was 5.2%. December, 4.5%. You know, and yes, they might be leading, and many of the challenges that you are outlining are about to manifest in the next 2 months. You know, where do you see inflation going with the dire picture that you've actually painted coming into the equation?
You see, now that's very important, because up to December, it's not only general inflation that came down to 4.5%. The part of food inflation as a component of that also declined. We see lower beef prices, we see lower maize prices, actually maize flour prices coming down. But now the problem here is, in the next 3 months, you will see the impact of the drought will be given through to the producer in terms of product prices, and that will definitely have an impact on inflation to increase from the 4.5% maybe to about 5.5% until the end of next year. So it will have a definite impact. Just to give you an indication, our transport, according to our transport index, transport costs year on year increased by 9%. So take that into consideration. We know crude oil declined. We saw the rand strengthening. So our energy prices going forward, transport costs actually should come down. That assists us. But on the other hand, you have electricity costs. And electricity is used in the production of poultry, intensive livestock industries in pork. You also have irrigation. Because if you don't have electricity, you can't irrigate. So
and there's going to be a hike, at least coming from Eskom.
Yeah, and that will actually lead directly into food prices as well.
Wessel, always good to have you on the show. Many thanks for making time to speak to us. That's where we'll leave it for this edition of Capital Connection. Many thanks to my guests. Don't forget to join us yet again at 6:30 Central African time. That's every Monday and Wednesday from us. Have a good night.